Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban al HaTorah. Obviously, we're in the middle of a war, and our learning should be for refuah shlema for the injured, for the return of the hostages, and for the victory of good over evil. Okay, I'd like to do at least three topics in the Ramban today. The first is really the first pasuk. It says the Torah, Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei, v'hu yoshev petach oel kachom hayom. And the problem with the pasuk, and the problem is that the action is missing. Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei, to do what? To say what? Right? God sort of disappears after the first pasuk. So this is a technical question, but it will morph into a much bigger discussion, a much bigger machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban in terms of visions in the Torah. What does it mean that God appeared? Did it happen? Did it not happen? Let's start with Rashi. Says the Ramban, the first Ramban in the Parsha, Vayera elav lashon Rashi levaker tachola. So Rashi says it's true. The pasuk doesn't say why God was coming to visit, but the reason he was coming to visit was to be mevaker cholim. Avram Avinu had just had a bris milah. That's the very last pasuk. The Ramban will make this point later. The very last pasuk in the very last bit in Lech Lecha was the mitzvah bris milah. So now HaKadosh Baruch Hu is coming the third day after his milah to visit him. Okay, let's skip a little bit and pick up as follows. U'v'sefer Moreh HaNevuchim ne'emar ki haparsha klal ufrat. What does it mean, klal ufrat? Vayera elav Hashem, that's the vision. And then come the details. Amar HaKatuv tchila, ki nireh elav Hashem b'marot hanevuah, ve'eich hayta hamara azot. Well, it was, ki nisa einav b'mareh, v'hinei gimel anashim nitzavim alav, vayomer imna matzasi chen beinecha, zeh sipur ma she'amar b'mareh hanevuah, le'echad mehem hagadol shebehem. So the first thing is there was a mareh, and the second thing is what happened in the mareh. Now asks the Ramban, V'im b'mareh, if it was just a vision, meaning it didn't happen, we would refer to a mareh in the way the Rambam refers to it as a dream. Okay, so if it was just a dream, V'im b'mareh lo niru elav rak anashim ochlim basar, it just appeared that people were eating, Eich omar vayera elav Hashem, ki hinei lo nira lo Hashem, lo b'mareh v'lo b'machshava. That's not called a mareh Hashem if it's just a dream. V'kacha lo nimtza b'chal hanevuot. V'hinei lidvarav, according to the Rambam, that it didn't really happen, it was just a dream. Lo lasha Sarah ugot, v'lo asa Avraham ben Bakar, v'gam lo tzachaka Sarah. None of these things actually happened. They were just a dream. Rak hakol mareh. V'im kein bo hachalom hazeh berov inyan kechalomot hasheker. It seems like it's a false dream. Kimat to'elet laharot lo kol zeh. Right? What's the point of God revealing all of this to Avraham? They're just silly details. The malachim eating don't matter. None of these things matter. And now he makes the problem worse. V'chein amar, so too the Rambam says bi'inyan vayeavek ish imo. Right? In the fight between Yaakov and the malach shel Esav. She'akol mareh hanevuah. That too the Rambam thinks was just a vision. Didn't really happen. Says the Ramban, V'lo yadati lama hayat soleh al yirecho b'hakitz. Well, if it was just a vision, why was Yaakov hurt the next morning? Why was he limping? Why do we have the mitzvah of gid anasha? V'lama amar ki ra'iti elokim panim el panim v'tinatzel nafshi. He was saved from seeing God. He had seen God other times. He was Yaakov Avinu. Right? This is a fundamental machlokes. This is one of the reasons why the Ramban was not the world's biggest fan of the Moreh. The fact that sometimes the Rambam describes stories in the Torah as being just visions. And the Ramban is unwilling to accept that. And he says, Aval yachshov shahayu hama'asim na'asim me'alehem v'hama'amarim b'chol davar v'davar mareh. Ve'ele divarim sotrim hakatuv asur lishamam af ki laha'amin bahem. It says the Ramban, it's asur to listen to them, or even just to hear them is asur. Right? This is the Ramban really taking issue with the Rambam. We're not going to try to explain the Rambam Shita. There is a rationale for it, but it's just interesting to note, I think I've said this before, that the Ramban was not a big fan of the Morah, yet the Ramban did more to promote the Morah than maybe anyone else. The top 10 ideas that we know from the Morah, we know because the Ramban quotes it ala Torah in order to disagree with it. So in a strange way, we know that the Rambam thinks there are stories in the Torah that are just dreams. How do we know that? Well, he wrote it in the Morah Nevuchim, but if you didn't read the Morah Nevuchim, how would you know it? Because the Ramban says so, al HaTorah. Okay, and the Ramban goes on to completely sort of disprove this idea. There's a very, very long piece in the Ramban, which we'll skip most of, but again, says the Ramban, well, if it was all a vision, so did the Malachim go to Stone? Did they meet Lot? Right? What's a vision and what's real? Did Lot make matzot for them, as the pasuk says? The Ramban says, of course he did. That's what the Torah says. Okay? So that's one issue, which is, did it happen? Did it not happen? How would the Rambam defend the Ramban's attacks? Which is, the Ramban's attacks are very, very strong. Which is, you could tell me that there's just a dream, but clearly things happen. Did the Malachim tell Sarah that she was going to have a son or not? Did Sarah laugh or not? Right? So it seems to me that the weight of the arguments are very, very much in favor of the Ramban. But then he picks up on another issue. And that is, okay, if it wasn't just a vision, if it really happened, what does it mean? Vayera la Hashem be'elonei mamrei. So Rashi had said it was levaker tacholeh. What would the Ramban say? So Ramban says something very interesting. I'm skipping to the very, very end of that first Ramban on the Torah. Va'al tachosh lahafsakat haparsha. First of all, he says, don't think to yourself, well, how could this just be a continuation of the parsha? Ki inyan mechubar. Of course, it's continued. V'lachein amar vayera elav, v'lo amar vayera Hashem el Avraham. Right? Because it's a continuation in the Torah. The introduction of different parshiot came much later. Obviously, the Ramban knew about them. The Ramban knew there was something called Parshas Lech Lecha, there was something called Parshas Vayera. But he says, in terms of the Torah, there was no such thing. The Torah is just continuing the story. V'haraya Vayera elav. Who's elav? So if you read it last week, maybe you don't remember who elav was. But if you just continued reading the psukim, you know the previous psukim were talking about Avram Avinu. So it must be that God appeared to Avraham. Okay. Aval beparsha ratza lisader kavod hana'asa lo be'et she'asa hamilah. God wants to show honor to Avram Avinu for doing the bris milah. V'amar ki nigleis alav hashchina v'shalach elav malachav levaseret ishto v'gam lahatzil lot echav ba'avuro ki Avraham nitbaser beven mipi hashchina. Okay. God told Avram he was going to have a son. V'sara mipi malach shediber ma'Avraham kidei shetishma Sarah. And Sarah heard, vatishma Sarai, right, vatitzchak b'kirba, she heard the malach telling Avraham. It really happened. V'zo kavanatam, says the Ramban, that's what Rashi means, shamru levaker tacholeh. Shelo haya ledibur ela lechavod lo. Says the Ramban, you see this sometimes in Tanakh. God comes to a person not for a particular reason, not to be mevaser him, not to tell him anything. God comes to a person to show him honor. Vod amru, mizbach adama ta'asali. Uma im zeh shebana mizbach lishmi, hareini nigle alav u'mevarcho. Avraham shemal atzmo lishmi, alachat kama v'kama. Right? Just like God appears after they built a mizbach avanim, so too God appears after Avram did a bris milah. Why is God appearing? Just to sort of support Avraham, just to endorse it, right? If a great person, if the President of the United States, if the King of England, I used to say the Queen, the King of England appears to you, that's an honor. Why did he appear to you? It doesn't matter to me. It matters that HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeared to me. It matters that this great person appeared to me. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, Avram Avinu was mal himself. He circumcised himself, at a late age. That's very painful. That's a real Mesiras Nefesh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to support him. So Rashi sees in that a kind of Bikur Cholim. The Ramban doesn't need the Bikur Cholim. He agrees with the idea, but he says the point was God didn't come for any particular reason. God came to support Abraham, to show that he really appreciated what Abraham did. And that's why it's a little odd. Where Vayera Hashem be'elonim amrei v'hu yoshev petach al kachal yom, and then the story starts, Vayisai na vayav v'nei shlosha anashim nitzavim alav, etc. Because the story is different than God appearing to Abraham. God appearing to Abraham was to support him, and the Ramban has other examples where that is the case in the Torah. Okay, let's go to the story of Sdom briefly, because again here, the Ramban's morality and how he sees the world really, really plays through. Okay. Perek Yud-Tet, let's read Pasuk Chet. Vayetzelem lo da pescha v'adela sagar acharav vayomor al na achai tareu hinei nali shnei vanot asher lo yadu ish otziana eten aleichem va'asu lahem katov be'einechem. I have 2 daughters. They've never slept with any men. I'll give you them. Rak lo anashim ha'el al ta'asu davar ki al kein ba'u b'tzeil korati. So if you're like me, that seems completely bizarre, right? On the one hand, you have Lot being a tzaddik and saying, I'm going to protect these people, and he's arguing with the people of Sdom. But he's going to give them his daughters? What does that mean? V'nei da'otam. So says the Ramban. Kavanatam. So first of all, the Ramban wants to talk about what makes Sdom so evil. Were they the worst people ever? So he says, V'kavanatam lechalot et haregel mi beinehem ki divrei rabotenu. They wanted to end immigration. This is the Ramban, with no political statements, certainly in the United States. Just, they wanted to end immigration. Ki chashvu sheba'avur tovat artzam, shehi kigan Hashem, ka'eretz Mitzrayim bo'achat tzor, they lived in a beautiful place. Yavo sham rabim. We need to keep people out, because everybody's going to want to live with us. Vehem hayu moasei hatzdaka. They were against tzedakah. Okay, now, what's the obvious question? Why did that Lot come? So he says, Aval Lot ba'ashro u'mamono ba'alehem. But Lot was rich. So maybe that's why they let him come. O shebikesh me'em reshut, o shekiblu lichvod Avraham. Maybe they made an exception, or maybe they made an exception for Avraham's nephew. Avraham was obviously world famous. V'hakatuv me'it shedod kavanatam. Shenemar, hinei ze haya avon stama chodcha, gaon shivat lechem v'shalvat hashket, hayalo v'livnotea, v'yad ani ve'evyon lo hechazika. Says the Ramban, that's what the Pasuk in Yechezkel says, that the real sin of Sdom was v'yad ani ve'evyon lo hechazika. They didn't let any of the lower class in, and they didn't help them at all. Uma she'amar ra'im v'chatoim lashem ma'od, shehayu machisim u'mordim b'shalvatam u'v'inui ha'evyonim. They were particularly mean to poor people. V'hu shama v'tigbena v'ta'asena to'iva l'fanai v'asir aten kasher ra'iti v'al dat rabotenu hayu bahen kol midot ra'ot. It's true. They had all kinds of negative character traits. Aval nigmar dinam aloto ha'avon mipnei shelo hechaziku yad ani ve'evyon. But says the Ramban, the reason why God wiped out Sdom and Amorah was because Bishita, right? They had a town hall meeting, and they agreed to be evil. They agreed not to support the lower classes. They agreed not to have social justice. They agreed not to let new people into the area. They agreed to be extremist in what seems like normal behavior, right? They were selfish, and they made selfishness one of the character traits of Sdom and Amorah. And the Ramban says, that can't be. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that can't be. There could be worse people in the world, but they're not doing it as part of an ideology of selfishness. They're not doing it as part of an ideology that we don't want to have to support people who are of a lower class, who have less money than we do. That's real evil, says the Ramban. And then the last part, Vidai says, Ki mishpat Sdom hayal lema'alat Eretz Yisrael. The last thing you have to know is even now, he says, Sdom was wiped out because it was part of Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't the worst place in the world. Ki hi michlal nachalat Hashem ve'eina sovelet anshei to'avot. The land of Israel can't bear evil people living in it. And therefore the Ramban, he doesn't say it explicitly, but he says, if Sodom existed any place in the United States or any place outside of Chutz La'aretz, okay, maybe God could have looked the other way or could have not destroyed them, because there could be evil in the world. But in Eretz Yisrael, as we'll see in other Rambans later on, which has its own beating heartbeat and its own sense of morality and its own idea that the land won't allow bloodshed and the land acts on its own, Sodom could not exist in Eretz Yisrael and had to be kicked out and had to be destroyed. Now, the point I mentioned before, when Lot says, take my daughters, the next Ramban, he says, Mitoch shivcho shel ha'ish hazeh banu lidei ginuto. In praising this person, Lot, we've also come to see his failing. And it's hard to miss it. Sha'ayat toreach ma'od al achsanya shelo lahatziloto mipnei shabu b'tzel korato, right? He's basically moser nefesh for the malachim because they're his responsibility. He brought them into his house. Aval sheyifayes anshei ha'ir behefker benotav ein zeh ki imro alev. But the fact that he thought to give his daughters to the Anshei Sodom in return for leaving these people safe, even though they were his guests, that's evil, or that's just a lack of awareness that your daughters are people. And the Ramban suggests, without reading it inside, the Ramban suggests that it could be that sexual immorality was so ingrained in Sodom that Avram didn't really think about it. That Lot didn't really think about it. Lot said, I'll give my daughters to them, it will end this whole, incident, and my guests will be safe. And it didn't dawn on Lot what a bad idea it is. And the very last line, we don't have time to read the whole thing, he says, Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'atzmecha ata mishamran? Could it be, Lot, that you're saving your daughters for yourself? Again, that's obviously not the case, but of course that turned out to be the case, right? Lot landed up sleeping with each of his daughters. Okay, he was drunk and it was after the destruction of the world and maybe they thought there was no one left in the world. I don't know. But even in this moment, because his idea was to give his daughters away, and because the sexual immorality of it didn't dawn on him, the Medrash Ki'ilu is saying that Lot was punished, that the sexual immorality of incest, of sleeping with his own daughters, didn't dawn on him, and that's how he did it, and that's what happened. Okay, so much for the story of Sodom. Now, let's go on. Let's go on to, I guess, the most important story in the parasha. Certainly, for us, for Jews, it's a point of pride, and that's Akedat Yitzchak. And the Torah says, "Vahi achar advrim ha'ela, v'ho Elohim nisat Avraham, vayomer elav Avraham, vayomer hineni." And just as an introduction to the Ramban, obviously the problem is going to be twofold. The problem is, one, bechira chavshis, and two, divine foreknowledge, right? If God knows the future, do we really have free will? And if we really have free will, does God know the future? Now, why does this come up in the Ramban? Because obviously, if God's going to test me, it sounds on some level that God doesn't know the future, right? Teachers in school give tests because they want to know, do the students know the material? That's the only reason for a test. So the Ramban is bothered by this. And he says as follows, V'alokim nisat Avraham. Inyan ha-nisayon. Nisayon, we would translate in English to be a test. Inyan ha-nisayon hu lida'ati ba'avur hayot ma'aseh ha'adam rishut muchletet biyado. Because, says the Ramban, and it's something he deeply believes, we have absolute free will, right? Am I going to drop this paper or not? It says the Ramban, it's completely up to me. Completely up to me. Im yirtzeh ya'aseh, v'im lo yirtzeh lo ya'aseh. So if that's the case, what does it mean, V'alokim nisat Avraham, that he gave him a test? Yikra nisayon mitzad haminusa. Says the Ramban, it's a test for me. Am I going to do something or not? It's a test for me. It's not a test for God. It's not that God wants to know. God already knows. It's a question of, will I do it or not? Now, how does this work? Aval hamenaseh yitbarach yitzavebo lahotzi davar min hakoach halapoal. God, the testor, wants to be motzi something from the potential to the actual. So I'll give you an example. It's a real one. I would like to believe that if I was walking past a river in the middle of the winter and I saw a little girl drowning in the middle, I would like to believe that I'm the kind of person who would jump in and save her. Even though it's wet, even though it's cold, all the things, I'd like to believe that I'm that kind of person. But I don't really know. But if one day I'm walking past the river and I see a little girl drowning in the river and I jump in and I save her, now I'm not a person who potentially would jump into a river. I think that's who I am now. But when it happens, I'm a person who actually did it. And there's a huge difference. And says the Ramban, Aval hamenaseh yitbarach, God, yitzavebo lahotzi davar min hakoach halapoal. God wants me to not just be a person who in potential would do it, but who actually did it. Lihiyot lo sachar ma'aseh tov, lo sachar lev tov bilvad. There seems to be, says the Ramban, a difference in how God rewards us. If I'm the kind of person who would do it, I could get some limited reward. But if I'm the kind of person who actually did it, says the Ramban, God has to reward me in full because I did it. And therefore, the Ramban says, God knew that Abraham would pass the test. It wasn't, let me see if he's willing to sacrifice his son. He's willing to sacrifice his son. But before the Akedah, Avram Avinu was a person who in potential, if asked by God, would have sacrificed his son Yitzchak. And that gets a small part of reward. But afterwards, he became the kind of person who did, who was willing to, who was actually willing to. And that gets a whole advanced level of reward. And the Ramban says, V'da ki Hashem tzadik yivchan. In addition, says the Ramban, God is only going to test tzadikim. Kishu yodea b'tzadik sheya'aseh ritzono v'chafetz lahatzdiko. When he knows that a tzaddik is going to pass the test, he tests him because he wants to reward him. Yitzaveh oto b'nisayon v'lo yivchan et harashaim asher lo yishma'u. But God's not going to test Rishaim. He's not going to test people who aren't going to pass. V'hinei kol hanisyonot sheb'torah letovat haminusa. Says the Ramban, all tests in the Torah are for the benefit of the testee, are for the benefit of the person who's being tested. God already knows the answer. The answer is they're going to do it. Now, these are two separate points in the Ramban. The first is l'hotzi me'hakoach halapoal, to make a person not just potentially, but actually that person. The second part, which the Ramban didn't need to say, but clearly he believes it, is that God only tests people who are going to pass the test. Now, it sounds true. It is true, obviously, but it sounds believable till you think about your own life. I fail tests all the time. People I know fail tests all the time. And the question is, what does the Ramban mean when he says he's not going to test somebody, or kol hanisyonot sheb'torah letovat haminusa? What does he mean that God only tests tzadikim and they only pass? So my sense is as follows. The challenges that we encounter in life, challenges with our children, with our parents, with parnasa, with all the things that people struggle with in life, those are not nisyonot. Those are not artificial, right? God doesn't appear to me and ask me to do something, and then I'm going to pass that test. No, God, the challenges that I encounter in my life, which I often fail at, they're challenges. But when God comes to Avraham Avinu and says, Kachna et bincha yichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak, that's not something that comes up in ordinary life. That's God intervening to give you the kind of test or the kind of nisayon that wouldn't normally happen. Those nisyonot, says the Ramban, always end in success, and never end in failure. And this idea of the Ramban is emphasized again in Pasuk Yud Bet. Ki ata yadati ki yirei Elokim ata, says the Ramban, mitchila hayta yirato b'koach. Originally, Avram Avinu was a Yirei Hashem, but just in potential. Lo yetzei lefal b'maaseh hagadol hazeh. It never came out. Ve'ata noda'a b'maaseh v'haya zichuto shalem. But now, he actually did it. When the Malach cries out, Ata yadati ki yirei Elokim ata, Avram Avinu, the Gadol Ador, the first monotheist, no one knew beforehand that he had Yiras Shamayim, that Yirat Elokim? No, he had Yirat Elokim in potential. But now he had full-fledged Yirat Elokim of the type that God can reward. That's Pshat in the Pasuk. And last Ramban for the day, a few psukim later, Yan asher asita tadavar hazeh v'lo chasachta et binchat yichidcha mimeni, right? What's he going to give him? He's going to give him Zerah. Says Ramban, Gam mitchila v'ticho ki yirbed zaro kechochlei hashamayim. But it's not the first time God is promising Avram children. What's the chiddush? Aval ata hosiflo. He adds the following: Yan asher asita maaseh agadol hazeh shenishba bishmo agadol. God is swearing in His own name, because you did this great thing, v'sheyirash zaro et shar oivav, that you're going to inherit your enemy's gates. V'hinei huvtach shelo yigrom shum chet sheyechaleh zaro. Avram Avinu was always worried. It's true, God promised him something, but maybe he sinned. Maybe he did something wrong. Maybe in the war with the 4 kings against the 5, he killed somebody who was innocent. Maybe God made the promise, but it wasn't going to come true because Avraham wasn't going to stand up to his side of the bargain. Now, says the Ramban, after the Akedah, God is saying, don't worry, Shlo Yigrom Hachet. I'm promising this to you unconditionally. O She'ipol b'yadav v'lo yikom v'hinei zo haftacha shelema b'geula ha'atida lanu. Avram Avinu, don't worry anymore that when I make a promise to you, you have to say to yourself, I believe God's promise, but maybe I let God down, maybe I sinned. Now the promise is absolutely unconditional. There's nothing you can do that would erase it. You're going to have children. Okay, so we saw a few interesting ideas today. One, Vayera elav Hashem be'elonei mamrei. First of all, that God often appears to people just to be supportive, not for any other reason. And second, the Ramban completely rejects the Rambam's idea that sometimes you have a vision, but it didn't really happen. Of course it happened, said the Ramban. Second, the story of Stone, what was so bad about Stone? They institutionalized selfishness. They institutionalized this idea that we don't want immigrants, we don't want to have to help anybody, we don't want the burden of a lower class. Says the Ramban, that can't exist, and in particular, it can't exist in Israel. Secondly, the fact that Lot often offered his daughters speaks well of his achnasas archim, but speaks very poorly about Lot as a person and his sense of priorities. That he would sacrifice his daughters for the malachim. That's a completely wrong and a completely mistaken approach. And finally, the idea of the Akedah, that God doesn't test people because he doesn't know the answer. Of course he knows the answer. God gives people the opportunity to become better. God gives people the opportunity who in potential would be a certain type of person to actually become that certain type of person. And if they do, then they lock in a schar of the type that they wouldn't otherwise. Okay? Yashkach, have a great Shabbos, and I'll see you next week.